By morning, the valleys below Lake Nyos looked as though time had simply stopped. Homes were still standing. Cooking fires had gone cold. There was no lava, no ash, no collapsed buildings, and no flood sweeping through the villages. Yet more than 1,700 people were dead. So were thousands of cattle, birds, and other animals. And the lake responsible for it all looked almost perfectly calm. On the evening of August 21, 1986, Lake Nyos sat high in the volcanic hills of northwestern Cameroon. It was a deep crater lake surrounded by steep green slopes, farmland, and small communities whose lives depended on the fertile landscape around it. Nothing about the lake suggested that it was storing enough gas to suffocate entire villages. There were no warning signs posted along the shore, no alarms, no scientific instruments watching the water. To the people living nearby, it was simply part of the landscape. Then, sometime that evening, something happened beneath the surface. Later witness accounts described noises like distant thunder. Some people reported seeing a pale cloud or a column above the water. Others remembered very little, because whatever came out of the lake reached them before they understood that anything was wrong. The exact sequence remains uncertain, but the result is not. A huge quantity of carbon dioxide suddenly escaped from the depths of Lake Nyos. The gas surged upward through the water, burst into the open air, spilled over the crater rim, and flowed downhill into the surrounding valleys. Carbon dioxide is colorless. It is usually odorless. And unlike smoke, it does not necessarily announce itself with heat, flames, or a visible wall moving toward you. In high concentrations, it can overwhelm a person within moments. The cloud from Lake Nyos was also denser than ordinary air. Instead of rising and quickly dispersing, it hugged the ground and followed the lowest routes through the landscape. Stream beds, hollows, and valleys leading directly toward nearby settlements. People did not have to breathe poison in the usual sense. The carbon dioxide displaced the breathable air around them. Many lost consciousness before they could escape. When rescuers and officials entered the affected area, they found a disaster that made almost no visual sense. People lay where they had fallen. Animals were scattered across fields. Some survivors woke after hours of unconsciousness with no clear idea of what had happened. Hundreds needed medical treatment. Some had skin injuries that were initially described as chemical burns. Later medical research suggested that at least many of these injuries were more consistent with the effects of prolonged unconsciousness, pressure, and damaged circulation than with a cloud of corrosive volcanic acid. That only deepened the mystery. What kind of natural disaster kills on this scale, leaves buildings untouched, and disappears without leaving an obvious weapon behind? At first, a volcanic eruption seemed like the most logical answer. Lake Nyos occupies a volcanic crater, known as a maar, in a region shaped by volcanic activity. Perhaps magma had moved beneath the lake. Perhaps an explosion had punched through the lake bed and fired a jet of gas directly into the air. It was a frightening possibility, because if a fresh volcanic eruption had caused the disaster, predicting another one would be extremely difficult. Teams of Cameroonian and international scientists began examining the lake. They sampled its water and gases. They studied its temperature, chemistry, sediment, surrounding rocks, damaged vegetation, and the pattern of deaths through the valleys. The evidence increasingly pointed away from a large new volcanic eruption. There was no convincing sign of fresh lava or volcanic debris. The lake floor did not show the kind of major disturbance expected from a powerful explosion beneath it. The deep water was not unusually hot. Chemical evidence also failed to support the idea that a sudden blast of newly erupted volcanic material had torn through the lake. Instead, the investigators found that the danger had already been inside the water. For years, volcanic carbon dioxide had been seeping upward from deep underground and entering the bottom of Lake Nyos. Usually, when gas enters water near the surface, it forms bubbles and escapes. But Lake Nyos is roughly 200 meters deep. At that depth, the pressure is high enough to force large amounts of carbon dioxide to dissolve into the water. It is similar to what happens inside a sealed bottle of fizzy-drink, although the scale is slightly less suitable for a picnic. Keep the bottle closed, and the gas remains dissolved under pressure. Release the pressure, and bubbles suddenly appear. Lake Nyos had another important feature. Its layers did not mix easily. In many lakes, seasonal cooling causes surface water to sink, bringing deep water upward and allowing gases to escape gradually. But near the equator, temperatures change less dramatically through the year. The deep water of Lake Nyos also became dense with dissolved minerals and gas. So the lake formed stable layers. Relatively fresh water sat near the top. Heavier, carbon dioxide-rich water remained trapped far below. Year after year, the bottom of the lake quietly accumulated more gas. Then came the part scientists still cannot reconstruct with certainty. The trigger. One possibility is that a landslide or rockfall entered the lake and disturbed the deep water. Another is that unusually cold rain, wind, or internal movement caused part of the water column to shift. Some researchers have proposed that the deepest water may eventually have become unstable enough to begin rising without one dramatic external trigger. Whatever started it, the first movement would have created a dangerous chain reaction. As gas-rich water rose, the pressure around it decreased. The dissolved carbon dioxide began forming bubbles. Those bubbles made the water more buoyant, causing it to rise faster. That faster rise lowered the pressure even more, creating more bubbles, lifting more water, and pulling additional gas-rich water upward behind it. Within a short time, a small disturbance had become a self-powered eruption of gas and water. Not a volcanic eruption in the familiar sense. A lake eruption. Scientists now call this kind of event a limnic eruption, or sometimes a lake overturn, although the exact physical details at Nyos are still studied and debated. The escaping gas appears to have driven a violent fountain and displaced enough water to damage vegetation around the shore. Deep water containing dissolved iron also reached the surface. Once exposed to oxygen, the iron oxidized, helping turn the lake a reddish-brown color after the disaster. To anyone arriving later, it could look as though something toxic had stained the water. In reality, the color was another clue that water from the lake's deepest layers had suddenly been brought to the top. There had also been a warning, although almost nobody understood it at the time. 2 years earlier, in August 1984, a similar gas release at Lake Monoun, another Cameroonian crater lake, killed 37 people. The event was so unusual that its cause remained uncertain, and the full danger posed by gas-filled lakes was not yet recognized. Lake Nyos revealed the answer in the worst possible way. The disaster killed more than 1,700 people and thousands of livestock across communities including Nyos, Subum, Cha, and nearby settlements. Survivors were displaced from land that had supported farming and grazing for generations. But even after the gas cloud dispersed, the problem was not finished. Carbon dioxide continued entering the lake from below. The natural system that had created the disaster was still operating. Scientists could measure the returning gas, but removing it presented a terrifying engineering problem. Disturb the lake too aggressively and the attempt to make it safe might trigger another release. The solution was surprisingly simple in appearance. A long pipe extending from the surface down into the gas-rich deep water. When deep water was pumped upward, the pressure fell and carbon dioxide formed bubbles inside the pipe. The bubbles made the rising mixture lighter, which pulled more water upward without continuous pumping. At the surface, the pipe produced a tall fountain of water and gas, allowing the carbon dioxide to escape gradually into the open atmosphere instead of accumulating beneath the lake. Full-scale degassing began at Lake Nyos in 2001. One pipe was not enough to remove the danger quickly, so 2 additional pipes were installed a decade later. The same basic process that had powered the disaster was now being used to prevent another one. Instead of allowing millions of tons of water to release their gas at once, the pipes gave the lake a controlled way to breathe. Lake Nyos is still monitored, because its geology has not changed and carbon dioxide can continue entering from underground. The disaster also transformed the scientific understanding of volcanic lakes and drew attention to other deep, gas-rich lakes, particularly Lake Kivu between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But the lasting lesson of Nyos is not simply that volcanoes can be dangerous. Everyone already knew that. The stranger lesson is that a landscape does not need to explode, burn, shake, or collapse to become deadly. Lake Nyos became dangerous partly because it was so stable. Its deep water remained undisturbed. Its layers stayed separate. Its surface concealed what was building underneath. For years, the lake did almost nothing. Then, in a matter of hours, that stillness ended. The invisible killer was carbon dioxide. But the thing that allowed it to grow was the lake's silence.